Hello and welcome to episode 22 of The Best Games Period. I'm your host, Jack Gardner, and with me tonight is Daniel Jones returning from who knows where. And I guess going into who knows where, Jeremy Brown is not here with us tonight, and we don't have a special guest, so it's kind of, we kind of lost a lot between last week and this week, so...
Wow, you're really setting us up for a great episode there, Jack.
Hey,
you know,
I just want people to know what they're getting into here.
Well, that's all we have to do is just set the bar really low.
Right.
And then we just, jump right over it.
Exceed it easily.
Right.
This week we're going to be talking about not Ocarina of Time like we said last week. This week we're actually going to be talking about A Link to the Past, Legend of Zelda, classic Super Nintendo title that many of us know and love. It's kind of become a bit dated now, so maybe some of our younger listeners might not know of A Link to the Past as well as maybe some of the newer Legend of Zelda titles, but hey, that's what this podcast is for, so you can learn new things, new and exciting things.
That's right. And speaking of, we called an audible.
Right.
To change the episode, because Jeremy's not going to be on. We know that he has some insight in Ocarina of Time, and not so much with Link to the Past, so we wanted to just do Link to the Past, because both of us are well-versed in that game, and I think we both hold it in pretty high regard. However, if you don't know what an audible means...
Try audible.com, purveyor of great audiobooks.
Some people don't know what calling an audible means, Jack.
Hey, I just wanted to talk to our very real sponsor, audible.com, sponsoring us since now.
I wish audible.com would sponsor us. They can anytime.
Yep.
But if you don't know what calling an audible is, it's a football term. We really do need to do a sports ball game sometime.
Yeah, definitely.
Of some sort.
I'm not super into those games. I know you know a lot more about them than I do. The last sports game I played, I think, was like Tiger Woods 2002. So that's where I am with that.
That was back when he was just cheating on women, but nobody knew about it.
Back when he had his own game line. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. Back when people would sponsor him. But unfortunately, he stinks now, too, and it's a real tragedy. I like Tiger Woods, and I feel bad for him. You know, you mess up in your personal life once in a while, and it's too bad that it's really bled over into his golf game. But anyway.
Speaking of stinks, have you tried Axe Body Spray? New sponsor of the show.
Axe Body Spray. You can find it on audible.com.
Starting now, just input code BESTGAMESPERIOD.
Oh, that'd be great. We've got this on lock.
Oh, yeah.
Jack. We need to figure this out.
All we need to do is tell audible.com to start selling Axe Body Spray. It makes sense. It makes sense, people.
Yeah. I mean, because when you're in the library reading something or listening to something be read to you on your phone, you want to smell as smart as you look, you know?
Indeed.
Yeah.
And what smells smarter than axes? They're sharp, just like you could be.
Speaking of axes, are you using an axe when you play Dark Souls 3? Because you're playing Dark Souls 3 right now, huh?
I am.
That was a transition.
That was a great transition from a conversation that was going nowhere real fast. But I'm playing through Dark Souls 3 right now. It's pretty good. I was using an axe for a very long time, but I switched over to the katana, so I could hit things faster and that were slightly farther away and maybe make them bleed.
Nice. I like to use fast swords in those games. So how do you like Dark Souls 3?
That's a complicated question, Daniel.
Oh boy.
Yeah. I like it. I think it's a great game. I think it's in the hierarchy of the Souls games. Its quality is probably the best. It's
okay.
Pretty well balanced. I think where a lot of my problems come in are general world design and level layouts are just very linear. And I guess I was kind of hoping for more of a return to form with the original Dark Souls, which was kind of more of an open world type experience, even though obviously there were better ways to go in the first Dark Souls. You could kind of go where you wanted, and the game would kind of nudge you and tell you, hey, those sword guys just killed you ridiculously fast and made you look like a chump. So maybe go a different direction. And I kind of miss that. I miss that. You only really get that in some of the optional areas in this game. Otherwise, there are just a few areas that kind of branch paths, and you can maybe take one boss on before a different one, but it's not the same sense of just being plopped in the middle of nowhere and being able to go wherever and figure things out yourself. That being said, I do think it's the most accessible of all of the Dark Souls games so far.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, it lays things out there much more cleanly. The story is much better explained, at least on it's still deep, but people who need a little bit of story to keep them going aren't going to be completely lost without reading the item descriptions, which are kind of how most of the Souls games transmitted their story. This one at least has a little bit more explanation going on, which is nice. I appreciate that. As someone who digging through item descriptions is not my ideal method of storytelling, I guess.
Is the story interesting? Is like the Lords of Cinder storyline interesting? Because, I mean, I personally found the world and lore of Bloodborne to be really interesting. But then what I've seen of Dark Souls 3 just doesn't look as appealing.
I mean, I don't think Dark Souls was ever meant to be a series. The original story of Dark Souls is just basically the gods created the world and lit a magic fire that keeps the world going and normal.
Right.
And that happened after a gigantic war that killed off a bunch of the old gods. They kind of established this new order, and it's been burning for hundreds, if not thousands of years. And now it's starting to die out, and the gods that started it are kind of crazy and insane now. And so there's a prophecy about someone marked with the dark sign, who's undead and can basically keep coming back to life and will be able to relight the flames.
Essentially, that's you.
Yeah, that's the player character. Okay. And most of the NPCs you run across are also undead people that have been trying to do the same thing you are and got distracted or are slowly going insane themselves or whatever. And so each of the Souls games the goal is to relight the fire. And each game also gives you the option to not do that and just plunge the world into darkness. It's the same plot. Each game kind of takes a different approach to how to go about reigniting the flame, like the different methods of doing it or whatever. But basically in Dark Souls 3, you need the 5 Lords of Cinder, or however many there are. I think it's 5. And you need to get them together to reignite the flame. And that will keep the world turning for another 1,000 years or something.
So you didn't start the fire. It was always burning since the world's been turning, right?
Yes. Yeah, exactly.
Okay. Though you did ignite it, you were trying to fight it, right?
Right. See, that's kind of the rub, because Dark Souls 3 is the last in the series, supposedly, as far as we know. So from what I've heard, and I don't think this is spoiling it or anything, because I haven't finished the game, but from what I've heard, there's a true ending to Dark Souls 3 where you can kind of end the cycle of fire rebirth or whatever. And to be honest, you could do that in the first one too, but because there are 2 more games after it that are specifically sequels, the canon ending is clearly you didn't do that.
Right.
Because there's an ending in the first Dark Souls where basically you snuff out the flame and become the eternal emperor of the Dark World.
One quick question, though. Do you recommend people play it?
Yes, if you like Dark Souls. If you like Dark Souls, you're probably already playing it.
Yeah, true.
And
what if you like Bloodborne?
It's a slightly different beast. I would say maybe try out the first one if you can rent it or something, and because it's very similar. It just does a little bit better job explaining what all the different attributes do and just how the game functions. It does a better job all around it doing that.
Well, I have the first one, so I'll just have to play it, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, Dark Souls 3 is great, but it's more Dark Souls, and I guess one of my biggest problems with it is just that it's kind of, it feels tired. Miyazaki's ready to be done with it.
Yeah.
I think. He wants to do something new. He said that in interviews, and I think it kind of comes through a little bit.
Well, you know what game isn't tired?
What?
Ratchet and Clank.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah. And that game was kind of exactly what I needed after grueling Salt and Sanctuary. Which, don't get me wrong, I put 30 hours into Salt and Sanctuary before I beat it.
Mm-hmm.
And loved it. I loved that game. Being that I've played 3 games that have come out this year, that's the best one of the 3
All right.
for me. So, I really enjoyed it as a side-scrolling Dark Souls type, Castlevania, Metroidvania type game. I really enjoy it. I highly recommend it. But then I played Ratchet and Clank, and it's just fun. It's just colorful and pretty and fun, and I'm really having a blast with it. It's constantly varying up the gameplay. There's always something different for you to do, whether you have different weapons to play around with, or they're putting you in different scenarios. You're maybe racing on a hoverboard, or grinding along on these rails, or you're jetpacking around a world collecting brains. Like, it's really interesting. It's all really fun.
Whoa, collecting brains?
Yes.
That seems really dark. It seems actually like something
these...
that would fit more in Dark Souls or Bloodborne.
You collect these, like, dinosaur brains. Yeah, it's really fun.
It's always fun to me how big of a difference context makes.
Yeah.
Because in a completely different context, collecting brains would be utterly horrifying and disgusting. Or kind of weird, but in Ratchet and Clank, it's just kind of like, oh yeah, we need some brains. Let's go get some.
No, it's great. It's a really fun game, and it's just cartoony, and I'm probably pretty close to the end now, but it's just a really fun game. It's just delightful. I'm really enjoying it. It was kind of exactly what I needed. I'm just enjoying it. Every once in a while, you just need a game that reminds you that games are just fun, you know?
That games aren't necessarily always about pulling your hair out in frustration.
Yeah, exactly.
Or getting bragging rights or whatever.
So, yeah, I mean, Legend of Zelda, Link to the Past.
Yeah, I mean, we probably could have transitioned a little bit more smoothly between these segments, but...
Yeah, we probably could have. I mean, that game can be pretty frustrating sometimes, too.
Yeah, not really in the same way, I guess.
Certainly not in the same way. But then again, it's also the kind of game that can just remind you how fun games can be.
Definitely.
Yeah. I love that game, Jack.
Do you?
I do. I think for me, Link to the Past was probably the first video game that I played where I said, okay, like, video games are my thing now. Like, I love video games. They're going to be something that I will always love. And it was the game that elevated video games from toys to more than that in my life.
Okay.
You know, they suddenly took a higher place of importance in my daily life, in my psyche. What about you? What's your personal history with Link to the Past specifically?
My personal history with that game is basically, I remember, because I didn't have it on the Super Nintendo growing up.
Right.
For the Super Nintendo, we had stuff like Super Metroid and Super Mario World, all that good stuff. We had a number of things on that, but we didn't have Link to the Past. And so my interaction with it was limited to whenever I would go over to my aunt and uncle's house on holidays, like Thanksgiving, Christmas. That would be in there. And it would kind of be a toss-up between the Lion King platforming game, which is a literal nightmare. That game is the devil. It's so hard. And it is beautiful. One of the most beautiful games on Super Nintendo, for my money. But it is hard as balls.
All of those Disney games at that time were really difficult.
Yeah.
And I would lump in, like, the Jurassic Park game into that, too.
Do you think that's because... I don't remember seeing them in arcades, but do you think there were plans to... Or were they put in arcades as kind of quarter eaters? Because that's the only thing... I
don't think so.
It's the only thing I can think of for making them that hard.
I spent a lot of time in arcades at that age, and I never saw them in arcades. They were just really difficult games. I don't necessarily think that it was, like, designed to be difficult. Those games were just difficult because they were kind of crappy games. Like,
yeah,
they're really not the best games, and the controls and the level design and the enemy design wasn't really balanced very well.
But they did nail the look pretty well.
They certainly
in
did.
all of those. But so my cousins always wanted to play The Lion King, and I was kind of I was fine with that, but I always kind of wanted to try and sneak The Legend of Zelda in there. And I managed to do it a few times, and so like I remember like loading up a save, and I was on top of the Dark World Ziggurat Temple in the center of the map, and just kind of running around, not really knowing what anything that was going on or really how to do it. But I didn't really get to dig my teeth into the game and beat it until it came out on the Game Boy Advance, actually.
Okay.
It was packaged with the Four Swords Adventure, I think.
Yeah.
Or is that the right game I'm thinking of?
I think it might have been. I think you're right.
It might not have been Four Swords Adventure. That might have been the one on GameCube. But
no, I mean, I could be wrong, but I thought Four Swords Adventure was the one that was kind of based on the same look, but was co-op.
Yeah, it was 4-player co-op, and it was a different adventure against like a wind demon named Vati, I think.
Okay.
Yeah, so that was a thing.
Yeah.
But at that point I was able to actually play through the entire thing.
I played this game probably 94, 95 when I got my Super Nintendo. I distinctly remember getting it for Christmas. Mm-hmm. I was so excited. I have very vivid memories of that Christmas morning going down and playing it before anybody was awake, and going to the basement, turning on the little wood-paneled JCPenney TV that we had in the basement, and putting it in, and that little twinkling music coming on with when the Triforce is forming before the menu pops up, and then that castle scene with the moat and the water. Oh my god.
And the sword comes down. Whooshing!
Yes, the sword comes down and the music starts, the heroic music that at the time I didn't know what chiptunes were, you know. I didn't know what 8-bit music was or 16-bit music was. I didn't know that these weren't full orchestras playing this music. But man, it sure sounded like just epic. It just sounded like what you would imagine like Lord of the Rings being like in video game form. And
well, that's part of the magic of that era of video games, because you filled in the gaps, like with your brain, your imagination.
Right.
And I think that's kind of an age past. Like, I think there are a lot of younger gamers out there who don't really connect with that material as well anymore. Even though you can still kind of see it happening with stuff like Minecraft. But there are some kids who, you know, look at the graphical differences between, say, Ratchet and Clank, the new one, and something like A Link to the Past, and don't understand why we'd
Right.
be wanting them to play A Link to the Past, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, they might even look at it and be like, well, there's Link Between Worlds on 3DS, why don't I just play that? And I mean, yeah, go play that, because that's, by all accounts, really a great game.
Oh, it is.
But
it's great.
I have not played it, but Link to the Past is the blueprint for the rest of the Zelda series, and also, I'm going to argue in this podcast, kind of the blueprint for very many Western RPGs and open world games.
Okay. I'm still trying to process. I guess if I were to go with like the blueprint, I would go with the original Legend of Zelda. Like when I think of A Link to the Past, I think of it as the perfection of the formula laid out in the original Legend of Zelda. And I'm sure we're going to be talking about a lot of Zelda games on this podcast.
Yeah.
But basically, Link to the Past just does everything that the original Legend of Zelda did on NES, but does it better. Like, more beautiful, more secrets, more items, more, there's a save system. Like, there's, NPCs that are actual characters rather than just weird anomalies that you sometimes run across.
Right.
But all of those elements were at least sort of present in the first game. So what makes you say this one is the blueprint?
I mean, just for me, I think it does refine that formula, but I mean that first Zelda, it just plops you right in there and gives you no direction whatsoever. And I think the way that this game kind of guides you, but also at the same time allows you to explore at your own pace. For the most part, there are gates.
Yeah.
In that game,
you need a certain item. Need a hammer to mash steaks or something.
Exactly. To progress, it's fairly open to you. It's not as open as the first one. But when you think about it, the size of that first game compared to what's the size of the world in Link to the Past, it's not quite on the same level anyway. So, I mean, I don't know. Just for me, just the way that it paces out the open world structure, and paces the way that you play through that.
Yeah.
Really is kind of it's the formula that I think the series really followed. It set the standard for what later games would become, and even Nintendo has said, talking about the upcoming Zelda Wii U, or that will probably be on the NX instead. Like the upcoming Zelda, they've said they wanted to get back to the pure open world of the first Legend of Zelda with that game, and because Link to the Past reined it in a bit, but to its benefit,
yeah,
in my opinion. And then from then on, the series really did follow that formula. And we were going to talk about Ocarina of Time, and we'll talk about it in a future episode. And I think it would be fun to do an Ocarina of Time episode, and then maybe at some point later do like a Link to the Past versus Ocarina of Time episode, because I really do think that Ocarina of Time is essentially Nintendo making a 3D version of Link to the Past.
I think when that day comes, we're going to have heated words on this topic.
Yes, we are.
Because I think that's way oversimplifying things. But I understand why you'd say that at the same time. And I understand why that's not a minority opinion. Like, that's an opinion many people share. Yep. However, I will say that I think you're right. Like, if I can sum up what you were trying to say about A Link to the Past, is just that if it had never happened, maybe the original Legend of Zelda would have faded into obscurity the same way Ice Climbers did. Or was that even the name of the game? I don't remember.
Yeah, Ice Climbers.
Who knows?
Yeah. Uh-huh.
Like, the only reason anyone knows about Ice Climbers anymore is because they were in Super Smash Brothers that one time. Other than that, maybe there's a refined version of that was never made for Super Nintendo that could have launched that into being the blueprint of all mountain climbing games to come after. You get the analogy I'm trying to make.
Yes.
I think
if you look at games like Skyrim or The Witcher, specifically The Witcher, like the way it kind of gates off certain areas to you, it's certainly wider and more open to you than Link to the Past ever was. But
so you're saying it inspired open world games as a whole?
Oh yeah.
Okay.
Oh, I am.
I don't know about that one. I think that might be a bit of a stretch.
The way that that game starts, and it ties in, it starts with this. You wake up, Link wakes up, and he hears this voice in his head calling to him, and his uncle had to leave in the middle of the night, in the middle of this downpour, this thunderstorm, and
his uncle is a knight, right?
Yeah. And he leaves, and Link is basically like, told to stay there and not go anywhere. Well, he doesn't do that because Zelda calls to him, and he hears this voice calling to him, and he has to act, and that's the beginning. Like, the game sets you off on this adventure, and then you go through the world, and it shows you parts of the world, and it kind of introduces the structure to you, and you go, first thing you do is you go into a dungeon to rescue Zelda, and it's a very rudimentary dungeon. It's a very basic dungeon, but on your way, you also discover your uncle in his dying moments, and he gives you the sword and the shield, and you go and you rescue Zelda, and then you escort her out of there, and then you're off on this grand adventure. And the way that the game sets up the story, and then it opens up and blossoms out so that you can explore more freely, and doesn't completely just direct you exactly where you need to go, although the map does have icons showing you where you need to go, which is helpful.
Yeah.
I think if it didn't have that, it would probably be kind of frustrating. So the way that it does that, I mean, that's also an influence on other open world games. That's not to diminish the influence that other games have had on open world games.
Yeah.
I don't believe that this is the only game to have that, but I think you can see the roots of something like The Witcher 3 in A Link to the Past. Are there tons of differences? Are those roots really difficult to see? Yeah, I think so, but they're there. Like, without A Link to the Past, I don't know what games like that would look like today.
Okay. I can see where you're coming from. I can see that.
Yeah. I don't know. You disagree.
I disagree, but at the same time, your point makes a lot of sense. It is the kind of thing where I find it hard to argue against that, except to say that, the original Legend of Zelda did that first.
True.
But that goes back to the point you made right before about how, this is the blueprint. This is what took what Legend of Zelda did and made it kind of like the thing everyone looked up to as kind of the standard.
Yeah.
So
I just think it did it so well.
Yeah, it did everything really well. Like, it's one of, like, I wouldn't give many games perfect 10s, but I think I'd give A Link to the Past a perfect 10.
Yeah, I think I would have to.
There's nothing it really does wrong or poorly. Like, maybe there are some boss battles that are a little bit more frustrating than they need to be. Maybe there are a few dungeons that are laid out a little bit more frustratingly than they need to be, but at the end of the day, those aren't huge problems.
Yeah.
Like, the game does a really good job of setting up challenges for you to overcome, and you have the tools and you have the perspective needed to basically make the game seem fair, and like you always have a shot. There are a few times where it puts you in tough spots, but that's okay. Like, that's part of having an adventure. Adventures aren't easy. And so, yeah, I can see what you're saying about it. And I think this was made with like a team of like 24 people or something like that. It was like obnoxiously small.
Yeah, but it was large at the time. Like, yeah, it was a big production at the time. But yeah, when you think about all that's in there,
you could spend dozens of hours, if not over 100, wandering around finding all the little secrets that are in A Link to the Past.
It was the first game to me that really felt like that epic kind of adventure. I mean, I've always been attracted to epics. Fantasy novels or Star Wars or anything like that. And of course, bled over into video games. And that was the first game to really feel like a grand adventure that could stand alongside those other fictions, works of fiction. And I was in awe of that game when I was younger. I really hold it on a very high pedestal. A lot of it is nostalgia, but I own that game and I play it every couple years, every few years. I don't play through it, but I'll play a good chunk of it typically, and just I have a blast every time.
Yeah. I'm gonna play devil's advocate. I kind of showed my hand a little bit early in this podcast by, saying it. I'd give it a perfect 10, but for the sake of argument, does this game hold up story-wise, like, compared to what we have now with storytelling? Like, if this game released today, would it still be highly acclaimed, or would it be kind of written off as one of those retro 16-bit inspired games? Kind of like how people really like Shovel Knight, but don't consider it like a great narrative achievement anymore.
Right.
Right. Do you think it'd be kind of along those lines?
I mean, I guess I never really considered it a great narrative. I just
the sense of adventure is more what you meant by
epic?
epic?
I think it was always just the sense of, like you said, adventure and wonder that it elicited from me was really what drew me to it. It wasn't necessarily the lore or the story, although I thought the story was great at the time. I was a kid, but I think the way that it presents the story is done pretty well. I don't know that the story really goes in very interesting directions. I mean, it doesn't really develop too much. But it was the first game I had played where a person dies that like matters.
Yeah, your uncle.
Or seemed to matter to the character, I mean, that his uncle dying at the beginning, that was like spoilers, The Last of Us beginning, where Joel's daughter dies right at the beginning. I mean, it was the first game to do that, and I thought that was really interesting. And I guess now that wouldn't have the same kind of impact.
I've a small question. Not to get you off your tear you were going on there, but
it's okay. I go on tears. You just have to cut me off sometimes.
What do you think there's a certain significance to it being his uncle and not like his dad or something like that? Because
I thought about that.
Uncle feels like a very specific choice.
Yeah.
And I can't for the life of me. There's nothing in the game that really gives any context to that. But it's weird that he's living alone with his uncle. Like is he an orphan? Like what's going on? I'm sure there are something in like the Hyrule Historia or something that explains this, but
maybe
or maybe not. Who knows?
I mean, King Arthur was an orphan, wasn't he? In legend, anyway.
I mean, there are probably legends where he was an orphan. There are probably others where he's not.
I mean, you look at a lot of epic fantasy like that, the characters often come from...
Does Link ever have a dad?
Broken home.
Or like parents?
Now that I think about it, I don't think he ever has. He has his grandmother in Wind Waker, right?
Yep.
Twilight Princess, I don't even think he had any like close family. And then Ocarina of Time, no.
Yeah.
He was just
orphan boy in the woods.
Yeah, boy in the woods with no fairy.
Yeah,
Weird.
Well, they at the very beginning of Ocarina of Time, they mention his mom bringing him to the forest, like the Deku Tree.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Okay.
But I mean, she's not in the game anywhere.
Yeah.
He has a sister in Wind Waker, but he doesn't. I guess I'm specifically talking about like parents, like.
Oh, she is his sister, isn't she?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I don't. I think you're right. I don't think he's ever had parents.
Yeah. I mean, I just Googled this on my phone, but I guess in the Legend of Zelda comic, he has a mother named Medilia, and his father's named Arn.
All right. Well, then that solves it. That's canon, I guess. I have my Hyrule Historia. If you want me to look it up, I can try to find it on there.
Oh, here's the plot of the comic. I'm just sorry. I swear I'll turn this off after I finish this. But in the comics, Link left his family at a young age, and he received an absolutely awful reputation. While he was gone, Dark Link had overthrown the kingdom of Calatia and imprisoned the queen. When Link returned home to visit his mother, Medilia, and his father, Arn, he was thrown out by Arn and was told to never show his face again. Link soon discovered the cause to Arn and Medilia's behavior and set out to stop Dark Link. His parents apologized and welcomed him back after he succeeded. Wow! So his parents thought he, a young child, had managed to overthrow and imprison a queen.
Right.
And as punishment, threw him out of their house and wouldn't accept him back until he had unoverthrown the kingdom. That is some serious shenanigans.
Hey, you gotta do what you gotta do. Till you have kids, Jack, all right? You'll never understand. Until you have your own child.
Yeah.
You'll never understand the lengths you need to go to make sure that they are, held responsible.
You've been deploying Quinn to foreign countries to overthrow dictatorships.
I do. I do that often.
And you can't come back for dinner until you
do it. Don't you come back till you've done that. No. You can see the influences of Shigeru Miyamoto in Link to the Past pretty clearly. I think Lord of the Rings is a huge influence. I think he said so.
Really?
Yeah.
Really?
Yeah.
I didn't know that.
I'm pretty sure I've read that somewhere. That Lord of the Rings was a huge influence on him creating the first Legend of Zelda, and I would imagine after that the Link to the Past.
Yeah.
you can see it. I mean, there's even a king like Theoden that is under a spell.
Yeah.
There's, and also, like I mentioned, King Arthur, like there is a sword in a stone that you pull out of it.
Yeah. Well, so we talked a little bit about Dark Souls before we got into this, but I think Dark Souls is the modern day equivalent of these classical Legend of Zelda games, like even more so than the current Legend of Zelda games.
Yeah.
I think they take the Zelda series as a whole has kind of taken this formula and iterated on it. But
gonna run it into the ground is what they've done. But yeah.
Hey, we can talk about that later. I disagree. I think they've made some pretty fantastic games. But I think Dark Souls does the same thing that Link to the Past does, because it basically just starts you off and is like, hey, here's some really confusing exposition, and now you need there are 2 bells and you need to go ring them. And that's then it's up to you to go do that. And it's pretty much the same thing in A Link to the Past. Once you get to a certain point after kind of the prologue area, it's just kind of like, hey, you have to go to these 3 places and get these things.
Right.
And then something will happen. And, there are tons of little things to discover on the way to going to those places. And, which one you go to first is up to you, and all these different things. And you're right, some of them are gated off, but some of them aren't. Like there are places you can get to before you necessarily have to.
Yes. And you get there and then you're like, oh, nope.
You realize you do not have the equipment you need.
Yeah.
So there's definitely that same kind of design, and that's kind of what I'm hoping to see. We mentioned already, what's probably going to end up being the Legend of Zelda NX, but that's what I'm hoping we kind of get back to with that one. I think that'll be an interesting return to form with a more open world.
Yeah. I agree.
And I think it's kind of like weirdly cyclical, because I think that return to form comes from the success of Dark Souls. Like, as weird as it may sound that Nintendo's, with their kid-friendly image, taking cues from Dark Souls, which is decidedly not kid-friendly in its image.
Well, I think what Dark Souls really does, honestly, is a return to the mentality
epic adventure
of those older games. No, I mean, yeah, there's that, but I think Dark Souls specifically just returns to kind of the structure of, maybe not the structure necessarily, but the pacing and challenge of older games, and just the way that they wouldn't explain everything to you. And there was a communal aspect to those games. You had to talk to your friends about, what'd you do here? How'd you do this? And Link to the Past definitely had a lot of that too, like for the longest time, I didn't know that you could even light torches in the dungeons. And I was just going around with my little flashlight torch thing, So, I mean, I think Dark Souls goes back to that kind of technique and mentality. And I think, yeah, you're right, that Nintendo's probably influenced by that, and that they see that there's still a way to make that work, and that not all hope is lost for that style of game.
I think we have to talk about why they made The Legend of Zelda A Link to the Past.
Okay.
Because I think it's really interesting that The Legend of Zelda and The Legend of Zelda, or really it's called Zelda 2,
yep,
they are completely different games. Like, very much gameplay-wise, graphically, structure-wise, everything's very different. Basically, Zelda 2 is like a side-scrolling RPG.
Yeah.
It's very strange. It's probably, in the history of the Legend of Zelda series, it's probably one of the least successful mainline entries. So A Link to the Past is kind of an attempt to, like, a very serious attempt to emulate the success of the first Legend of Zelda game.
Yeah, kind of a course correction.
Yeah, like, just, they took a risk, it didn't work out, so they returned in full force, and it paid off really well.
Yeah.
Do you know how many copies this game has sold? Like, total across all systems? Because it must be absolutely colossal.
Oh, total? I have no idea. I know that it sold pretty well on the SNES, but I don't know exact numbers. And all total, I can't imagine. I mean, it's good. You're right. Like, it's got to be a ton. I would buy it on every system that I could, really. So, like, if I had a 3DS, I would buy it on that because I would love to have it on the road and be able to play it on the road.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I don't know. You're probably right. It sold a lot, but I want to talk about the combat in the dungeons.
Okay.
Because I think, like, the combat is really interesting because it's actually fairly simplistic.
Yeah.
Like, you can do this little charge up twirl move, and you can slash.
Mm-hmm.
And you can block with your sword. And that's pretty much it. You have other items that you can use. You have bombs, and you have the boomerang. But, like, for the most part, you're using your sword, and you're charging up a little twirl attack. One thing that, if I'm nitpicking about this game, one thing that I actually kind of dislike is how freaking small the sword is.
Yeah.
And how short that sword is, and how, like, Link's left-handed, and he's always holding his shield in his right hand. And if you have an enemy that is on your right-hand side, but in front of you, they can hit you, but you can't hit them. Because you're swinging with your left, and you're just completely missing, and they're, like, right there just hitting you with their right hand or whatever, you know? Oh, man, that frustrated the heck out of me. And I know that was, like, part of the design, and eventually I got used to it and figured out, okay, you know, so I just need to move.
Yeah.
Like, and I just need to flank them a little bit, and whatever, but that sword couldn't have been, like, a little bit longer, like a few pixels longer at least, please.
I
don't know.
In turn, if we're gonna start nitpicking, a gaming classic, there are some items in The Legend of Zelda: Link to the Past that are just dumb. Like, I don't like them. I think that rod that makes little blocks, I hate that thing. Yeah. I think it's, in my mind, I associate that with one of the least useful items I've ever used in a video game. It irritates me so much. And I don't know, there are, like, the fire rod and the ice rod. I don't think those are necessary to complete the game. You can just find them, and they're useful, but you don't really need them. And I don't think they're the most useful things in the world. I think there are cooler rewards. Like, there are the magic medallions you can find that let you unleash, like, screen-wide attacks. Those are pretty cool, but also there are, like, you don't need them, and they're not really that useful either. Like, they're just kind of cool. Yeah. So it's just kind of like, to me, there are, if we're going to compare it maybe a little bit, I don't want to go into this too much, but if we're going to compare it a little bit to, like, Ocarina of Time, the extras in Ocarina of Time were really awesome. A bigger wallet so I can carry more more rupees? Yeah, sign me up for that. A bigger bomb wallet so I can have more bombs? Yeah. A magical flaming arrow? That's sweet. A magical shield? That's great. like all these different things. But
they're certainly more practical.
Yeah, they're
more useful.
Yeah, and that leads to more excitement when you find them because you know they're gonna come in handy.
Right.
And the Legend of Zelda, like Link to the Past, isn't the only one guilty of it. Like the Legend of Zelda series as a whole has sometimes struggled to have useful items. Like one that comes to mind is from Twilight Princess and that weird gear wheel thing that I am 99% sure they only put in there because they had a cool idea for a boss fight that involved it.
Yeah.
But yeah, there are certainly a bunch of not that useful items in Link to the Past. And I think,
I think it doesn't help that the menu is kind of clunky. But then again, I don't think they really improved that with Ocarina of Time either.
Can you imagine? You know how today in like games like Bloodborne, we have when you pause and bring up a menu, it doesn't pause the game. Can you imagine if that was in Link to the Past? It would be the worst.
It would be impossible.
Oh yeah,
I wouldn't be able to complete that game. It would just be really frustrating, overly frustrating. And parts of that game could get really frustrating. Like, there's just puzzles sometimes that aren't completely clearly communicated to you. Where dungeons where you have to do certain things that, I mean, again, like, unless you looked it up or you talked to somebody who knew what to do, sometimes
or
it
wandered
is not
around
easy.
for like 10 hours. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And every time you leave a room, the enemies respawn.
Yep.
So that could get really tedious and frustrating. So I mean, totally, I see flaws in A Link to the Past, and it might be the kind of game that I look at with rose-colored glasses, and somebody today who was raised on more modern Zelda games or more modern games in general might not be able to go back to and actually really enjoy. So I understand that.
Do you think they're flaws, or do you think? Because I'm a big, like, one of my big things as a human being in general and outlook on life is that context is really, really important, and we can't divorce things from the context that they were in. Otherwise, we miss the point.
Sure.
I was just reading an article. This is a little bit of a tangent, but I was just reading an article about how everyone always misunderstands the Robert Frost poem about the two paths diverging in a wood.
Yeah.
And everyone's always like, oh, well, he took the path less traveled by, and that's made all the difference. And really, the poem is about just a guy who's trying to justify his choices, because he makes clear earlier in the poem that both paths are essentially the same amount of traveled. And so he's just trying to justify his life choices, and the actual intended message of the poem is supposed to be kind of silly, but everyone took it very seriously. Even Robert Frost has said, like, hey, when I initially presented this, I was trying to make it as silly as possible, and everyone took it seriously.
Of course they did. Yeah.
And so the context of The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time is that when it came out, it was a freaking technological masterpiece. Like, the amount of things that they managed to fit onto a very limited cart and fit within a very limited controller on a very limited system is pretty astronomical. Like, even making a game like that today would be a huge undertaking.
Yeah.
And many indie developers could only wish they made something as great as Ocarina of Time. And by Ocarina of Time, I mean A Link to the Past.
I knew what you meant. Yeah. I mean, it was a blockbuster, you know? It was a blockbuster game. Sega likes to claim that Sonic was the first blockbuster game, and I think they came out the same year. But the first Sonic and A Link to the Past came out, I think both in 1991. But like, A Link to the Past was a freaking blockbuster. That game sold really well, and it was a showcase for what the Super Nintendo could do.
Yeah.
You know? As was Super Mario World, but Link to the Past just was so much more vast, it seemed. You know? It was a different kind of game than I think most people were seeing at that time. But I do think, yeah, there are things that, like, I think your point about the flaws is interesting, because I think everything they did in that game was deliberate. And I think that all of the design choices, the short sword, the left-handed, the light world, dark world, that was specifically to save space and make the game longer. And the way that some of the puzzles were designed and all of that, I think all of that was deliberate. I think a lot of it was probably a little bit hamstrung by the technological limitations at the time, but with what they had, they did a lot. And I think yeah, if you go back and play that game now, you have to kind of accept it for what it is. And,
well, not even
it is very time and place.
Not even accept it for what it is, but it's the same kind of thing where you nowadays, when we go back to play, I think this applies to early 16-bit games, but it also applies a lot to early 3D games, because objectively, if you look at an early three-dimensional game, it's going to look terrible compared to things we have now. And so part of it is understanding the context of what that early era of gaming was capable of and what they managed to design and make in that. Like, in that space where 3D gaming was very difficult to wrap your head around when all games had been 2D before that. And so context is really important when you're trying to evaluate games. Like, kind of understanding Call of Duty fatigue is reliant on understanding that for about 10 years after Call of Duty Modern Warfare 4, or however long, shooters were mostly brown and gray. Like, you had Gears of War, and you had Call of Duty, and you had a billion other copycats. And you need to understand that in order to appreciate shooters of that time period.
Yeah. I agree. I just think it might be difficult for people to go back to.
Yeah.
And I mean,
well, yeah, like, I'm not saying, like, I get what you mean, but at the same time, I guess I wouldn't expect, like, if we're talking about people who are adults and need to take, if you're an adult, you need to take context into consideration, because you're an adult and you live in the real world, and that's how the real world works. You have to take context. You have to keep that in mind when you're at work, when you're at home. You can do different things. Can't do the same thing in the office that you can in your house. But with kids don't understand that so well. So very likely, if a kid went back to try and play this game, they're not going to know how to appreciate it the same way we do.
Right.
So yeah, I get what you're saying. I think. Unless I'm just talking about a completely different topic for like the last 20 minutes.
No, we're on the same page. Okay. I don't know. So, where do you think that game ranks? Because when I was saying that, like, that it hasn't necessarily aged perfectly, as perfectly as I remember it. Like, I would give it a perfect 10, but that's going by my memory as well. Yeah. I don't think many games from that era have aged incredibly well. At least, like, I think they've all aged well, but when you that is if you have an understanding of the retro video game style. Yeah. I think it's difficult for anybody without that understanding of kind of that more obscure game design to go back and play Mega Man or Sonic and Mario kind of, I think they're pretty simple. They're kind of self-explanatory.
I think there's a good analogy, a parallel here between like black and white movies and color movies.
Sure.
Because a lot of young people will look at color films and black and white and immediately assume black and white movies are boring because they don't have color in them. So obviously they're inferior just on that visual assessment alone.
I can't judge. I did too when I was young.
Well, yeah, exactly. Yeah. And I know I did, but my parents kind of pounded an appreciation for older things into me. And so it takes a while. It takes maturity to build up an appreciation for older things, I think. And I think that's eventually going to be kind of the breaking point between, not the breaking point, but 16-bit early 3D stuff is going to be stuff that, our kids aren't necessarily going to understand right away. They're going to have to grow up and learn to appreciate that stuff. The same way you don't grow up with an inherent appreciation of like abstract art or something like that. You don't know who Picasso is. You just know that he draws faces really weirdly, but over time you realize, oh, this was actually really genius. This is really forward thinking. This is really refined and good. This is an achievement. And I think that's what that era is going to be.
Yeah, I think a lot of it you can look at as historically as like something. These are games that set the groundwork for what video games would become and could be. And even though a lot of AAA games really kind of eschew the strict ground rules and gameplay guidelines that 2D retro games kind of set, because you don't have to necessarily stick to those guidelines anymore. You can just present spectacle to people. But I think we're seeing trends in indie games and games like Dark Souls and there's still plenty of other games that aren't just Call of Duty, that aren't just like that. You still see games following those ground rules that games like Link to the Past set. And so you can trace a line back to them, and I think that's really important to understand.
Yeah.
So I think that's why I like to do this show, because I think we have a lot of people listening who are younger, who maybe haven't played some of these games, and we probably do a pretty bad job of explaining why they're worthwhile, but they are worth playing. And if I would make the argument, and you might disagree, but I would make the argument that you go back and play any game made on the SNES, Genesis, anything from then back, I think Link to the Past would be the one game. if you had to play one, if you could only play one, that would be the game that I would
Interesting.
recommend.
I think there are a lot of people who would disagree with you on that.
Yeah.
I think there are people who would go with like Chrono Trigger or
Super
Mario World or Final Fantasy VI.
Yep.
I think there are a lot of really, really great games, but I think you're right. I think to an extent, like I think it is up there with some of the finest work that you could possibly manage to do on the Super Nintendo at the time. Like, hands down, that is kind of like, you're not going to find anyone who's like, oh yeah, Link to the Past, that game is a piece of crap. I wouldn't play that if my life depended. No one's gonna say things like that because it is iconic. It's clearly great. Like, the things it does almost flawlessly across the board. And to this day, people, like, if you go to remixing websites, people are still remixing the music from A Link to the Past.
The music is so good.
Yeah, I mean, the music's great. The visuals are lush. They look alive. Like, you look at that and you're like, oh, it looks alive. Which is all the more jarring when you go to the Dark World and everything looks dead and decaying.
Dead. Yep.
And, you know, it has fun with itself at the same time. Like, the first time you go to the Dark World, you're a pink bunny. Like, there are memorable moments all throughout that series. It's the first time you get the Master Sword. You know, all... when you... The twist that there's actually a Dark World. That the wizard is actually Ganon. All these little things. It's a real great thing, and it's weird having to consider that something, because I don't think when it came out people considered games great art.
No,
but I think when we're older and gray, like, it's going to be held up as an early work of art for this medium.
Speak for yourself. I'm already getting there.
Well, I wasn't going to say anything, but
no, I agree, and I mean that's a good spot to actually bring it back around, because at the beginning that I said, like, that was the first game that made me realize that games could be a legit thing, you know?
Yeah. Like, it's one of the first games where the story isn't in the instruction manual. You remember instruction manuals? This was back when those were a thing.
Oh, I miss them.
So, I mean, like, it set a precedent where, hey, games can also tell narratives, even though, you know, games had been doing that, but games like this hadn't really done that all that much beyond Save Princess. And granted, you are still saving princesses, but there are other things that happen too, like the two lumberjacks or the witch, or like, everyone has their own little story that's going on in this giant world. I think I remember tearing up a little bit with the pipe player, like in the woods.
Yeah.
That was sad. That was genuinely sad.
Yeah. So, I think I know where you fall on this, but what would you say is Legend of Zelda: A Link to the Past one of the best games, period, Jack?
Oh, definitely. It's definitely one of the best games, period. I think if the more heated discussion, the more contentious discussion, I like what we talked about today. I was surprised at where this conversation went. But I think the more contentious discussion is a comparison between A Link to the Past and other Legend of Zelda games, be that, you know, Majora's Mask or Ocarina of Time is kind of the obvious big one.
Yep.
And where it falls compared to other games that are arguably of that same quality in the same series. And I know where you fall on that. I think you know where I fall on that, but it's not a conversation we're having today.
Yeah.
But there's no one who's not... I don't think there's anyone who would argue A Link to the Past isn't a formative game for the industry and for a lot of people who grew up during that time in the industry. So I don't see how anyone could really argue against this being one of the best games, period. Like, I really don't. Maybe if you have something terrible happened to you, your uncle stole your Super Nintendo or something, and you hate Legend of Zelda as a result of that. Shout out to my pal Jeremy. But I don't see how anyone could not see the value in this game. I just don't.
Yeah, you said it.
Other than the younger people that we were talking about earlier in this podcast who won't see the value in this game, because we spent a good time talking about that.
Yeah, but I think they'll learn to appreciate
if
you don't necessarily enjoy your time playing the game, I think you could still appreciate how ahead of its time it actually was and what it did. Yeah, I mean, I think you can look at that game and see how it's probably influenced so many other games since, even if you don't necessarily love playing it.
Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, for me, definitely one of the best games, period. I just want to mention to our listeners that when you hear this episode on Monday the 25th, Jeremy will be in Connecticut at my house. So we plan on doing one. We're gonna do the first episode we've ever done where two of us were in the same geographic location.
Yeah.
Same room.
We're all spread out across the country. We record this. I'm in Minnesota. Daniel's in Massachusetts or Connecticut, whatever. One of those small places.
Yep.
We lose half our subscriber base, whatever. In Connecticut, and Jeremy's in Montana. So every week we pull together from across the country to get this show on the road. It's pretty neat.
Yeah. And so we're going to be recording an episode with a guest that night. So Jeremy and I will be on the mics, probably the same mic. So we'll see how that sounds. Hopefully it sounds all right for you guys. And I plan on doing, if you're hearing this episode on Monday morning when it first goes up, we plan on doing a bit of live streaming that day. So that should be fun. If you want to see Jeremy and I playing a game together, playing a few games together. I don't know what we're going to play, but we'll see.
Where can they find you? On Twitch.
Tune into that. I'm IndieJones84 on Twitch.
All right.
Just like everything else on Twitter, I'm IndieJones84. Jack, your riverboat.
Jack.
And Jeremy is MojoMonkey12. And you can find the show at Best Games Period on Twitter as well. So yeah, follow us, and Monday could be fun if you're hearing this.
Yeah.
On Monday.
What are we covering next week?
Next week, we are going to talk all about Team Fortress 2.
Yes.
I know. Jack, you love that game.
I do, and I happen to know another person who really likes that game, who is our guest next week, who's also named Jack. How weird is that?
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
Let the speculation begin. Jack, I just want to say thank you for joining me on this adventure tonight, this grand, epic adventure.
Yeah.
Tonight.
And thanks for joining me, too.
Yeah, you're welcome. You know what? Thank you. Thank you for thanking me.
You're welcome.
All right. And thank you, listeners, for putting up with us and joining us for episode 22.
Yep.
Yes, 22 of the Best Games period. If you like the show, let us know and share it with your friends. We would love that. You can follow us on Twitter, like I said, Best Games period, or at Best Games period. And you can find the show every Monday on SoundCloud, Libsyn, our hosting site, iTunes, Game Informer, and Extra Life community blog. It's never a bad time to sign up for Extra Life as well to raise money and awareness for the Children's Miracle Network hospitals. We definitely encourage that. Right, Jack?
Indeed.
You can also watch video versions of the episodes on YouTube, which personally is my favorite way to consume our show. Come back next week for what should be a very interesting discussion on Team Fortress 2 and an enlightening discussion as well, because I never knew that Jack was so into a shooter like that. So that should be entertaining. But until next time, thanks for listening to the Best Games period.
So those of you who listen to the podcast know that typically we end out on a closing song. This week's closing song is actually an awesome remix of pretty much the entire soundtrack to The Legend of Zelda: A Link to the Past. So it's quite a bit longer than usual, but stick around. I think you'll really enjoy it. By Carbohydro M, and it's titled Unsealed. Enjoy.